It was a pretty typical night. I have kind of a unique job. I work late and travel quite a bit delivering packages and whatnot to young people. I landed on the roof of what seemed like an average house in an average neighborhood. I carry a list of all the stops I need to make, so I checked it a couple of times just to make sure I was, at the right place, on schedule, all that stuff. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I grabbed my sack and started climbing down the chimney. There was no wood at the bottom. No ashes or grate or anything. I thought, that's weird. Alabama gets pretty cold around this time, and I could tell the house didn't have central heating. And there was a quietness to the place that, I don't know, it just didn't sit well with me. But I had a lot more houses to get to, so I shrugged it off and stepped out into the living room. Before I could even see where I was, I immediately felt a sharp pain shoot up my left leg. And that's when everything went black.
I work in a large warehouse, or workshop, if you will, on the eastern side of the gumdrop forest. Do a lot of work with my hands, making toys, trinkets, worldwide distribution. Every year we have a pretty big deadline, and it was looming. I remember that night I was working with my good buddy Sugarflakes. We were pretty close. We'd been employed at the workshop for over 100 years, and our kids grew up together. We lived a block away from each other. It was a bit of a walk from the workshop to the village, and we liked to sing carols and throw snowballs, make the time pass by. And I remember Sugarflakes stopped to do a snow angel, so I decided to catch some snowflakes on my tongue. It was right about then that I first saw it out of the corner of my eye. It was pretty dark where we were, and the trees are pretty dense, so it took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. But after a bit, I realized there was a large reindeer standing about 30 feet from us. I remember thinking, my God, that looks like Blitzen. What's he doing out of his corral? Blitzen was one of 9 reindeer that we work with and have worked with for years, so I'd know him anywhere. But when I called out to him, he didn't respond. And it was right then that, I thought, something doesn't feel right here. Sugarflakes was on about his 5th snow angel, I think, when I told him to get up. For some reason, he didn't seem to hear me, so I walked over to him. That's when the animal charged.
I originally came to Earth a couple thousand years ago, do some work for my dad in the Middle East, and ever since then I just haven't been able to stay away. So I'd visit from time to time, and I remember back in the 90s, I would work the Easter pageant circuit. It was low profile, decent pay, plus most of the actors I'd seen were playing me all wrong. I was doing a 2-week run in a small Colorado town. Great company. This is my 3rd year with them, and the whole cast was just so on point. Great tech crew, really solid group. I remember this particular year, the understudy for Judas had to take over because the regular actor had the flu. Now this new guy was a real hoot. I mean, just so charming and really friendly. He seemed to develop an affinity for me very quickly. He was constantly asking me to come hang out with him after rehearsals, after the show. On our closing night, the cast stuck around to help break down the set, as you do. And one by one, people left until finally it was just me and Fake Judas. I gave him a hug. Thanked him for a great run, and I was about to teleport into another dimension when he asked me if I could help jumpstart his car. And I remember walking around to the front of his car and popping the hood. That's when I knew something wasn't right. The battery was fine. I mean, I'm more of a carpenter than a mechanic, but I could see inside the battery, and I'd say it had a good 2-3 years left of juice in it. I remember I turned to look for Fake Judas, and that's when I felt the gun press against the back of my head.
To find that I was sitting against a thick beam. It was dark and very cold, I remember that. And I couldn't feel my left leg at all. It was like it wasn't even there. I took a few minutes for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and when I looked down, I saw that a big metal bear trap was enclosed around my left leg. I remember noticing that the blood that pooled around my leg was the same. I heard footsteps above me, kind of quickly walking around. Then a door opened and the light from the other room spilled in just enough so that I could see I was in a basement. There was a figure standing in the doorway. It was just a silhouette, but I could tell that it was a little boy. The boy started walking down the stairs and I just said, "Who are you? Can you help me? I'm hurt." I don't know why. I guess maybe because he was a little kid, I just assumed he was there to help me. But once he got closer and I saw the smile on his face, I knew that this kid wasn't one of the nice ones. He got real close, just right up to my face. And he couldn't have been older than 10, but I could smell the alcohol on his breath. Then he looked over and pointed to the corner of the room where my sack was sitting. His expression turned really cold. It's like the life went out of his eyes.
There was no time to react. The animal was just so fast. I remember jumping to the side, but Blitzen's antlers caught me in midair. It spun me around and I hit the ground pretty hard. Then I heard screaming, so I flipped over just in time to see Blitzen goring Sugarflakes with his antlers. He'd been pushed a good 24 feet. Blitzen had him up against a tree. I remember thinking how tiny my friend looked compared to this enormous animal. Blitzen threw him on the ground and immediately started stomping on him with his hooves, and that's when Sugarflakes stopped screaming. I knew I had to help him. So I started throwing snowballs because that's all I could do. After about the third one, he finally stopped and looked up at me. I remember the look in his eyes and the froth around his mouth. The animal looked insane. It was faint, but it was very shiny. I would even say it was glowing. It descended towards me, and as it got closer, I realized what it was. One of the reindeer was known for being a bit more ornery than the others. Some say it's because of his deformity. See, he's got this shiny red nose. The other reindeer excluded him because of it. He was an outcast. I remember trying to stand up and felt a shooting pain down my right leg. I thought, well, that's broke. But I didn't care. He slammed into me with his antlers, pinned me to the ground, and tossed me around like I was nothing. Then he walked up to me, and I remember it was so deliberate, and he pressed his nose up against my chest. My coat started to smolder and then caught on fire.
He was pushing the gun up against the back of my head pretty hard. Then he got up behind me real close to my ear. I can still remember the smell of his breath. It was like he'd just eaten a poop sandwich. And he whispered, "Don't scream, or I'll kill you." I remember his voice was trembling, like he was nervous. And he told me to get in the car, so I did. He was real jumpy. I kept looking around, fidgeting. We pulled out of the parking lot, and instead of driving into town, he started heading away. That's when I thought, okay, this guy wants to do something pretty bad. After about an hour, he pulled off onto this small dirt road that led into the woods. We drove another 20 minutes or so, and the sun was starting to set. The headlights of the car were just bright enough so that I could see a little shed about 20 yards off in the trees. He turned the car off but left the headlights on so we could see. And he grabbed me by the arm and kind of yanked me up and out of the car and bonked my head as I came out. It really hurt.
He pulled the sack over to where I was tied up and he set it on my right side next to my arm. It's when I looked down and saw that he'd left enough slack for me to be able to reach into the bag. First, he'd ask for typical little boy gifts, baseball stuff, action figures, video games. This went on and on for a few hours, and I started to think this is okay. I can handle this, you know. Then he asked for me to make his parents get back together. I knew I was in trouble. My sack contains a lot of gifts, but this was not one of them. I told him that I couldn't give him what he wanted, that it wasn't possible. He wouldn't accept it. He kept screaming at me over and over to give him this impossible gift. Finally, he stopped and he got real quiet. And that's when he asked for a pair of pliers. I've delivered a lot of items to kids over the last couple hundred years, and pliers were always pretty low on the list. I knew right away that he was asking for them because he intended to hurt me. I reached inside the bag, and as I lifted the pliers out of it, I kind of flicked them toward Billy as hard as I could with half my arm tied down. I remember they clipped the side of his face and he screamed and turned away. That's when I kicked him in the stomach as hard as I could with my left leg. He ran up and he kicked my wounded leg over and over. At this point, I was in so much pain that I was struggling to stay conscious. He sat on my lap and he looked up at my face, and I could see that one of his teeth was missing and blood was running down his mouth. He looked me right in the eye and said, "You took out one of my teeth. Now I'm gonna take out some of yours."
Rudolph's nose had burnt through my coat, and he was kind of working his way up to my face. I had had a beard at the time, and his nose was so hot that it set my beard on fire without even touching it. I tried to wrap my arms around his antlers to push his head away, but the thing was just too massive. He was digging his nose into my face, and I thought, I gotta do something here, I'm not gonna make it. Somehow, I got my arm around one of his antlers, and as soon as I felt his eye, I dug in as hard as I could with my fingers. He reared back and kicked his front legs in the air and turned around and took off into the sky. I rolled over in the snow because my clothes were still on fire. Then I immediately looked around for Sugarflakes. He was lying where I'd last seen him. Thankfully, Blitzen was gone, but my friend wasn't moving. He had deep cuts all over his body and his face. Both of his legs were broken. He had a huge gash in his neck that glitter was just pouring out of. I tried to act as quick as I could. I tore my sleeve off and I wrapped it around his neck. And that seemed to help a bit, but he'd just lost too much glitter. I knew his only hope was for me to get to the Gingerbread Village as fast as I could.
He led me into the shed, and he opened the door, and there was just this immediate smell of death and decay that just washed over me. It was like 20 lepers mixed with the bubonic plague. He pushed me inside, and there wasn't a lot of light, but I could barely make out a big shelf with a bunch of rusty tools on it. There were blood stains on the walls and the ground. It was like something out of a horror movie. And it was very apparent at this point that I wasn't the first person Fake Judas had brought here. He closed the door to the shed and told me to lay down on the ground. Then he took my sandals off and he set them on a shelf next to a bunch of other pairs of shoes. I remember he was really careful about it. He kind of stared at them for a few seconds. It was like he was admiring them, like it was some kind of weird ritual with this guy. Then he turned back to me, took his own shoes off, and that's when he attempted to lie with me.
He couldn't get them out, and I remember him getting really upset at that. So instead of pulling them out, he just started hitting me in the mouth with the pliers. At that point, I thought of my wife. How she was probably sitting in a rocking chair, knitting me another sweater, with no idea what was happening to me. I have a sense about when little kids are asleep. I can kind of see them. So I could tell that Billy was asleep upstairs somewhere. I started rocking back and forth, just trying to loosen the ropes. And after a few minutes, I was able to pull my right arm out. There was a box just within arm's reach that had a bunch of dishes and plates in it. I reached out and got a hold of one of the plates and managed to get it out. I started tapping the plate on the concrete floor, and eventually a piece of it broke off, and I used the sharp edge to start cutting through the rope. At this point, survival was the only thing on my mind. I stood up and kind of hopped on one leg up the stairs. I could tell that Billy was still asleep, and I figured I was so close to getting out that I just stopped caring about waking him up. I was free now, and I wasn't gonna let him hurt me anymore. I got about halfway through the front yard, and then I just broke down. I started screaming, "Help!" just over and over. I remember there was a woman walking her dog, and her face just turned white when she saw me. She dialed 911 on her cell phone, and she stayed with me until the police and the ambulance got there. I survived because I knew I had more to do in this life. It wasn't my time. And I wasn't going to let a naughty little boy deprive millions of nice children the material possessions they deserved.
My body wanted to stop. But in my head, I kept thinking about Sugarflakes' wife and kids. He has a little gaggle of girls. And I knew if they were ever going to see him again, it was up to me. It was a long way to the village. And after about an hour of limping down the road, I was really starting to get exhausted. I couldn't feel the lower half of my body. And finally, my legs gave out and I collapsed. I managed to roll onto my side and was on the verge of passing out when I saw 2 red lights coming down the road. My first thought was, oh no. Rudolph's coming back and I can't move. I thought, this is it. I'm gonna die. But as I got closer, I saw horses. And then I heard yelling. It was Twinklebuns, my shift leader from the workshop. He and a few of the other guys were supposed to meet Sugarflakes earlier that night, and when he didn't show up, they went out looking for him. I remember yelling to them to leave me and go to Sugarflakes, so one of them scooped me up on a sled, and the rest of them continued up the road. When I heard Sugarflakes didn't make it, I guess I can't say I was surprised. I know that sounds cold, but when I saw him lying there in the snow after he'd been attacked, I knew. I didn't want to accept it at the time, but he had just suffered too much. He was more than a friend to me. He was my brother. And I wish every day that I could have done something to get him help in time, but I couldn't. And I wish it. I survived because Sugarflakes needed my help. In the end, trying to save my friend is what saved me. It forced me to not give up until help came. And I'll never forget that.
He put his hands under my robes, and as soon as he started rubbing my thigh, that's when he officially crossed the line. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt when I'm judging them, but there was no denying at this point what was in Fake Judas's heart. Usually I'll say a clever one-liner before I smite someone, like, feed my sheep. Conjure a flock of carnivorous sheep, they'll come in, eat the person or whatever. But it'd been a long day. I was tired, so I just snapped my fingers, erased him from existence. On my way out, I resurrected the other people who Fake Judas killed over the years, and they were all confused, just like, What's going on? Where are we? Then they realized and got all weepy, started hugging each other. I'm just standing there going, hello. Anytime, guys. Took them 15 minutes to say thanks. Ridiculous. I survived because I'm immortal. My dad created the universe. I basically have superpowers. I mean, is that even a serious question? Is it not obvious? I'm not going anywhere. Eternity. Come on. Are we done?
So, if I was sitting across from one of your friends and they had to sell me on Mr. Ricky Leary, what are some of the good things that they would tell me?
Well, I have been divorced 5 times. Which, of course, shows you I'm a one-man woman.